Arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and ex-Defense Minister Yoav Gallant on charges of committing war crimes in Gaza. Just a day earlier, the US vetoed a ceasefire resolution at the UN Security Council. So what are the implications of these developments? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Tom McRae. The International Criminal Court has issued warrants for the arrest of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the Defense Minister he sacked, Yoav Gallant, saying there are reasonable grounds to believe they have committed war crimes in Gaza. It's also issued a warrant for senior Hamas figure Mohammed Deif. Less than a day earlier, the US vetoed a motion at the UN Security Council calling for a ceasefire, standing alone in its opposition to the proposal. As the chatter and briefing continued after the vote in New York, dozens more Palestinians were being killed by Israel in Gaza. During 13 months of war and with nearly 44,000 dead, the US has not backed a single motion at the UN calling for a ceasefire, abstaining only once to allow a motion to pass in March. Israel ignored that, continuing its genocidal war with US weapons and Western support. So will the arrest warrants have any impact on US policy? Is the US becoming more isolated over its support for Israel? And what would it take to get the US to support a ceasefire and break with Israel over Gaza? We'll be speaking with our guest shortly, but first, this report from Kulsum Sharif.
The International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, his former defense chief Yoav Gallant and Hamas leader Mohammed Deif on charges of committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. It comes a day after the United States once again backed Israel at the United Nations Security Council.
Those against?
Casting a lone no vote, the US vetoed a resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. The proposal demanded an immediate, unconditional and permanent ceasefire. It also called for the release of captives held by Hamas. But despite weeks of backroom discussions to craft a motion that would pass, the Biden administration killed it.
We made clear throughout negotiations we could not support an unconditional ceasefire that failed to release the hostages. Because, as this council has previously called for, a durable end to the war must come with the release of the hostages. These two urgent goals are inextricably linked.
14 of the 15 council members voted in favor of the ceasefire plan. It's the fourth time the US has used its veto to block a ceasefire resolution since the war began more than a year ago. The Palestinian ambassador says the veto power is allowing Israel to continue its genocide in Gaza.
There is no right to mass killing of civilians. There is no right to starve an entire civilian population. There is no right to forcibly displace a people. And there is no right to annexation. This is what Israel is doing in Gaza. These are its war objectives. This is what the absence of a ceasefire is allowing it to continue doing.
Majid Bamia said the defeat of the motion will just mean more death and destruction.
A ceasefire doesn't resolve everything, but it is the first step towards resolving anything. And what is the answer of those who are still unwilling now, after all this death and destruction, not to call for an unconditional ceasefire? Is it to accept that the killing should continue until we resolve everything while we watch that we are resolving nothing?
Israel's ambassador thanked the US for its support and said the war in Gaza will continue.
The resolution brought before this chamber was not a path to peace. It was a roadmap to more terror, more suffering and more bloodshed. Israel will continue to defend itself.
Wednesday's veto comes as Israel continues killing, displacing and starving Palestinians in Gaza. There have been repeated warnings of famine in the northern region, where no aid has been delivered in 40 days. A recent UN report said Israel's campaign in the Strip is consistent with the characteristics of a genocide. Despite that, the UNSC is still unable to take action. Kulsum Sharif, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Okay, let's get a range of perspectives on the US veto from our guests. In London, Ontario in Canada, Michael Lynk is a human rights lawyer and the former Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in the Occupied Palestinian Territories. In Dubai, Hala Rharrit was an American diplomat for 18 years, focusing on political affairs, human rights and counter-terrorism. That was until April, when she became the first US career diplomat to publicly resign over President Biden's Gaza policies. And in Amman, Shaina, who is a communication advisor in Palestine for the Norwegian Refugee Council. Thank you all very much for being here on what is turning out to be a historic day for Israel, as well as the Middle East in general and the wider world, of course. Michael, if I can first of all start with you. As a human rights lawyer, can you just put into context and give us the significance of these International Criminal Court arrest warrants that have been handed down?
Well, you're right. This is historic, and it's historic also for international law as well, and the whole concept of accountability. We've had lots and lots of international law that's pronounced very critically with respect to Israel's conduct of its occupation and with Israel's conduct of this war on Gaza. Yet this is the first time that an ally of the United States where arrest warrants have been issued by the International Criminal Court. This will mean that Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant will not be able to travel to 124 countries, including virtually all of Europe, because those countries are members of the Rome Assembly for the International Criminal Court, and they are obliged by the Rome Statute to arrest anybody for whom there are outstanding warrants for. This also obviously stains further Israel's reputation in the world with respect to its standing among other countries, its standing at the United Nations, and it also increases the stain with respect to the United States. The one thing I'm worried about in the months ahead is how the United States will wind up reacting. We've seen letters written to the court by Republican senators basically saying, we're warning you, do not take any steps against our ally Israel with respect to arrest warrants. So a showdown is coming in the months ahead.
OK, we'll get on to the repercussions of that potential showdown a little later in the program. But Shaina, I want to come to you next and just outline a little bit of the detail that the ICC put out there. They said that the crimes alleged against Netanyahu and Gallant include using starvation as a tool of war, and say that there are reasonable grounds to believe that two of them oversaw attacks on civilian populations. I mean, does this vindicate all of the voices around the world that have been saying that is exactly what has been happening in Gaza for over a year now?
Absolutely. For over a year, as you said, we've been calling out, we've been saying that Israel has been obstructing aid. Israel has made it very, very clear that they had intentions to obstruct aid from the very beginning of this escalation of hostilities. And we've seen consistently throughout the past year that time and again, humanitarian assistance is being prevented from entering Gaza, being prevented from being brought to communities in need. We're seeing an entire population on the brink of famine. People are starving. Just this week, the UN reported that in south of Wadi Gaza, where the conditions were a bit better than in the north, only 16% of families received their a reduced monthly food parcel. I mean, this is after a year of us calling for openings of more crossings, calling for an increase of aid, calling for protection of humanitarian workers and civilians so that aid could be safely distributed. It's no surprise that the court found this, because this is what we've been saying for more than a year.
Hala, obviously the US has been the biggest backer of Netanyahu and Israel in its war in Gaza. Can that US support continue, though, given these arrest warrants?
Unfortunately, it will. And let me just start by pausing and acknowledging what most of the world is feeling right now. Finally, finally there's a sense that the international community is taking action. Far little too late, but this is not just strictly about Gaza. It really is about the rules-based order. It's about international humanitarian law. It's about justice. And the fact that finally, after over a year of genocide, the ICC has come to this decision, it's almost as if so many of us have been holding our breath and we can finally breathe a sigh of relief. But I can assure you, and this is very unfortunate, but I can assure you that the United States and this administration will continue to do everything it can to undermine this decision. I can imagine right now what's happening in the State Department. Secretly, many American diplomats are celebrating this because they do believe in the rule of law. But the political decision coming from the White House and from the Biden-Harris administration is support Israel at all costs, even if it violates international law, even if it violates American law, even if it loses an election. And we're going to continue to see that, unfortunately, even after this ICC decision.
Okay, so in your eyes, you don't see anything changes when it comes to the support of Israel by the United States. Michael, we know Israel doesn't accept or recognise the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, but what does it actually mean going forward? Does anything change when it comes to Netanyahu? I mean, apart from, potentially being restricted from travelling to 124 countries?
No. Keep in mind that the International Criminal Court does not hold trials in absentia. You actually have the defendants present in the courtroom in The Hague in order to proceed. So unless Israel voluntarily surrenders them, which it will never do, or the United States voluntarily surrenders them, which it will never do either, there will be no trials for the foreseeable future because the two defendants will avoid those countries that belong to the Rome Statute and who are compelled to issue the arrest warrants. But as we said, this will further stain Israel's standing. It will further stain the United States' standing as well.
Just quickly, how difficult will it be to prove these cases in court, especially in the charge of weaponizing hunger in Gaza, which they've been accused of?
Well, you can be sure that the prosecutor's office would not have sought the arrest warrants, which it did in June, unless it had strong evidence with respect to these various crimes, including the crime of starvation and the blockage of humanitarian aid. But there has been an extraordinary amount of evidence, an extraordinary amount of statements made by respected and responsible organizations, including the United Nations, including many major humanitarian organizations that can testify to the ways in which the population is suffering with respect to the lack of food, the lack of water, the lack of housing, and the lack of other forms of humanitarian aid in Gaza. So all of that, I'm sure, has already been assembled and will continue to be assembled in the prosecutor's office should one or both defendants wind up in The Hague.
Okay. Shaina, does this change anything for the people in Gaza right now? I mean, is it going to change the conditions there, or is there actually a fear that Israel could push back even harder against that and take it out on the people that are trying to survive in the Strip?
What we've seen over the last year is that very little influences Israel in its decision-making and ability or willingness to permit more aid, improve the humanitarian situation. Just over a month ago, we saw the U.S. administration, the Secretaries Blinken and Austin, sent a letter to Israel giving Israel 30 days to improve humanitarian conditions on the ground in Gaza. We, along with 7 other NGOs, submitted a report card that found that Israel overwhelmingly failed at meeting each metric that the U.S. had laid out for them to show improvement in. And October saw the lowest number of trucks, a daily average of only 37 trucks entering Gaza. Yet somehow the American administration found that Israel had met the conditions that they had set forth and decided to allow Israel to proceed without any type of consequence. So I think so long as Israel does not face actual consequences, so long as there's no accountability, we're only going to continue to see Israel acting with impunity, and civilians who have been bearing the brunt of this for the last almost 14 months are going to continue to suffer and be deprived of the basic needs that they have for their survival.
Hala, you were the first US diplomat to publicly resign because of Biden's policies when it came to Gaza. You talked a little bit about some people in the diplomatic corps in the US might be privately cheering the ICC's decision to charge the two of them. Do you think that more will follow your lead and step down or at least speak out loudly against Biden's policy?
To be quite frank, Tom, I don't think more will resign. And I'm not very thrilled to be saying that out loud. But what I saw when I was still in the department before my resignation was an absolute chilling effect, that diplomats, experts were basically told to be quiet, to keep their expertise to themselves and to fall in line. And that's what I saw most diplomats doing, fall in line. But I would urge my former colleagues that this is the time to not fall in line. I swore an oath to the Constitution when I became an American diplomat, and it is because of that oath that I submitted my resignation. Now, I can tell you what's going to happen after this. The State Department is going to write something called demarches. That's every embassy and consulate is going to have to demarche the host government, meaning provide some talking points. And they're going to try to discredit this ICC ruling. They're going to do everything they can to get other countries to publicly discredit this ICC ruling. Now, for those conscientious diplomats, I urge my former colleagues, refuse to deliver those demarches. Push back on Washington. Even if you can't resign publicly, don't go along with the illegality of this policy any longer. As Shaina outlined, the Palestinian people can't suffer any longer, and it's time for all of us to use our voice, including those that remain within the State Department.
Michael, how do you think that the US, that Biden in particular, will react to this? You talked earlier of a potential showdown. Can you just elaborate on that?
Sure. I mean, it's astonishingly clear that there's virtually no red line that Israel won't cross over in the conduct of this war. And there's virtually no red line that the United States will not eventually wind up trying to justify to the rest of the world. We can see the arguments that were made yesterday at the UN Security Council by the United States when it justified its veto of the latest attempt to bring in a full and immediate ceasefire. It was very clear that in Ambassador Robert Woods' speech that he saw all of the blame resting on Hamas. There was no criticism or even cautionary remarks made by Ambassador Wood with respect to Israel. And with respect to his comments saying, we're opposing this resolution because we want to see the hostages freed immediately, and that's not in the resolution. Well, he and I are reading very different resolutions. The resolution was very clear in its first operating paragraph. Not only was it calling for an immediate and final ceasefire with respect to the war in Gaza, it was also calling for the immediate unconditional release of all prisoners being held by Hamas. The United States yesterday would not take yes for an answer with regards to this, and there's going to be really no credible diplomatic justification for the vote that was offered. So the willingness of the United States under the Biden administration to be able to defend virtually everything Israel has done to date only bodes, I think, more fear and darkness as to what's going to happen when the administration changes in 2 months' time.
And we'll get to Donald Trump's presidency and what that could mean in a moment. But Hala, just on the US veto at the UN Security Council, I mean, the proposal basically said it demanded an immediate, unconditional and permanent ceasefire. It also called for the release of captives that have been held by Hamas. So what exactly did the US have a problem with? Can you just give us that context?
So I can give you the State Department's official talking point, right, which I absolutely do not agree with. What is coming out of the podium is they will not agree to a ceasefire unless the prerequisite is the release of the hostages. It is a very one-sided perspective. As was mentioned, the ceasefire resolution was clear, unconditional release of the hostages. And I can say that is absolutely disgusting. I'm not mincing my words. It's disgusting that the administration is using the hostages to continue this genocide. The families of the hostages, their pain and their suffering in order to continue arming Israel, in order to continue violating human rights, international law. The families of the hostages themselves are protesting against Netanyahu every day. They recognize that he has been the obstacle. They recognize that Hamas has agreed to previous ceasefire deals and that Netanyahu has changed the goalpost every single time. That is why they have publicly been denouncing Prime Minister Netanyahu and have been protesting against him and his government on a regular basis. Yet the administration refuses to put blame where it belongs and is using the suffering of the hostages and is also enabling them to remain hostages. There is a diplomatic solution if the U.S. administration chooses to use its leverage, chooses to abide by U.S. law, which would mean to halt offensive military weapons to Israel. That would force a deal. Yet the U.S. administration currently refuses to do that, and people on all sides are suffering as a result.
A number of the US allies also backed the resolution. After the vote, there was a discussion, and Majid Bamia, the State of Palestine's deputy UN envoy, very powerfully said at the Security Council session, a ceasefire doesn't resolve everything, but is the first step towards resolving anything. Take a listen to what he said.
Maybe for some we have the wrong nationality, the wrong faith, the wrong skin color. But we are humans, and we should be treated as such. Is there a UN charter for Israel that is different from the charter you all have? Tell us. Is there an international law for them, an international law for us? Do they have the right to kill, and the only right we have is to die?
Their statement has gone viral and has been picked up right around the world. Shaina, do you think that that is because it's exactly how Palestinians feel right now?
Absolutely. Palestinians, especially those in Gaza, feel abandoned by the world. They feel that there's a double standard. They see international laws being applied selectively. They see one set of rhetoric for Russia's occupation of Ukraine and another rhetoric applied to them living under occupation for more than 55 years at this point. And so for Palestinians, they've lost, at least the ones that we speak to in Gaza and the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory, they've lost hope and confidence in the international system. They've lost confidence in international law. They don't understand how their suffering has been broadcast for more than 13 months on television, and yet people continue to die each day, not just those being killed by the bombs and bombardment, but those being killed due to deprivation of food, medicine, clean water, shelter. And so it's not surprising to hear Mr. Bamia speak at the UN about the feelings of the double standards that Palestinians are facing, and the fact that their suffering has gone unaddressed for over a year in Gaza and over 55 years of occupation and 75 years of displacement.
Yeah, Michael, this resolution had been worked on for weeks. Yet again, for the fourth time, it has been vetoed by the United States. What will it take for them to back, for the US to back a ceasefire at this point in time, do you think?
It's hard to say. I mean, there's been so many opportunities for the United States to be on board for a permanent ceasefire. Recall that they themselves proposed to the Security Council in June a three-step staged ceasefire that they said had Israel's support. And once that resolution was passed by the Security Council in June, Resolution 2735, the United States made no concerted diplomatic effort to try to put it in place and listen to virtually every Israeli objection, which was when Israel tried to backtrack on why it said it initially supported the resolution. So if the United States can't even enforce over 5 months its own proposals for a resolution, which had the blessing of the Security Council, and now says that the hostages remain foremost in the Americans' mind when the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages was first and foremost in this resolution that was vetoed yesterday. It's hard to imagine what, aside from the obliteration of Hamas, will wind up drawing American support for any resolution in the future.
Hala, some thought that Biden, or maybe hoped that Biden might soften his stance since the election. He's on his way out the door. That doesn't seem to have happened with the veto of the UN resolution. Trump's coming in next. What are the consequences of him in office?
Honestly, it's unpredictable. And I worked under the Trump administration in South Africa. And one thing I learned and other diplomats learned is that his policymaking is unpredictable. And oftentimes we found out the news of the day, as everybody else did, through his Twitter feed. So I'm not going to try to pretend to be able to know what he's going to do. But I can say this, those that he has put around him signal which position he's going to take. And those appointments thus far have been very troubling and have been very concerning. Individuals that are very much influenced by the pro-Israeli lobby and, in the pockets of the pro-Israeli lobby, to be quite frank. On the other hand, Trump went to Dearborn, Michigan about a week or so before the election, making him the first presidential candidate to go. Critics are saying it was strictly an election ploy to try to get votes from the community in the Arab American community, the Muslim American community, all Americans that really care about Gaza. And he was urging peace. Perhaps that was strictly an election ploy. But honestly, if his advisors would see that this is a golden opportunity for him to declare a win and a victory. The Biden administration has said for months and months they've been trying to secure a ceasefire. If he comes into office and is able to secure one, which, by the way, the vast majority of Americans are in favor of a ceasefire, it would be a win. But at the same time, we've seen that he, like the Democrats, are very much beholden to the pro-Israeli lobby. Well, it's going to be who whispers loudest in his ear or who is able to influence him more. And so I would stress to the American people, now is not the time to be complacent. I know that everybody is tired after the election season, and so many of us have been absolutely traumatized and devastated by what has been happening in Gaza. But now is the time for Americans, in particular in the United States, to make their voices loud and clear that under the Trump administration, we will not continue to allow our tax dollars to be used to murder children in Gaza. And the pressure needs to be maintained on the incoming administration.
Shaina, if we can finish with you briefly, can you just give us a sense of how Palestinians are thinking and feeling right now? Because for them, this is literally about life and death.
Palestinians, by and large, have lost hope. I think the situation has deteriorated so much in the last several months. I spoke to a colleague yesterday who was telling me about his family in Gaza, 60 families sharing a single toilet, a family member who couldn't get surgery because his body was too weak to withstand being under anesthesia. These are the types of daily sufferings, trying to find food, trying to find clean water. I don't think Palestinians in Gaza have very much opportunity to think about larger political issues because so much of their day is focused on trying to scrounge up the basic needs, which are now almost entirely out of reach.
Thank you so much for joining us, Shaina, Hala and Michael. We really do appreciate your insight. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Tom McRae, and the whole team here, bye for now.